Well, we're going to start. I thought I'd just begin by introducing myself and ask the rest of the panelists to introduce themselves. This is the first panel I've moderated. It's really the first time I've moderated anything, including my behavior at a convention. And I'll try to do my best. I'm Paul Witcover. By this time tomorrow, I will have won or lost 1 or 2 awards. And we'll be celebrating or mourning, but celebrating for others. Anyway, the topic here is the moral distance between the author and the work. We're going to, in a minute, Kathryn here is going to offer a definition of moral distance so that we know kind of what we're talking about. I'd kind of like to point beforehand to 2 aspects of the question, one of which is something that we ask ourselves and figure out for ourselves almost constantly, which is on a personal level, where do we draw the line? How do we define the moral distance? Who do we read? What do we choose not to read? Or, you know, as applying that to any art form. And then the other is on a more social level. What do we as a group or as a society, as a culture, however you define it and on whatever level you define it, what do we decide is allowed to be read or appreciated or looked at, and what do we decide needs to not be looked at or should not be made available to be looked at, and you know, do we have the right to do that, and so on.
We're going to cover all that in an hour?
That's just your
No, just at the first question.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, I just think it's good. It's important to have those 2 aspects of the question in mind. So with that, let me pass it this way.
Well, the folks running the convention and deciding who would be on each panel tried to gather together a mixture of people both with high moral values and people with none, and it will be up to you over the next hour to decide which of us is which. I'm not only a writer and an editor, but I've been attending conventions since I was 15, and therefore the problem of the distinction between the writer as words on a page and the writer as an individual and making judgments on individuals has been going on in my head for many years, so maybe that's why I'm wanting to talk a little bit about.
I'm Eric Flint. I'm an author and editor. I'm one of the ones with very high moral values.
I'm Nancy Kress. I'm the author of 26 books. And I'm here because I whined so much about not being on this panel that eventually they put me on this panel.
I'm Kathryn Cramer.
I'm Jack Skillingstead, and I am immoral.
So you want me to read my formulation? Okay. Initially, when I saw the topic of this panel, I thought I knew what moral distance was, and then I thought about it for a little bit and realized I didn't, and I started Googling. My favorite answer I got from Google was 3,430, which was the distance from the area I was to some town called Morel or something like that. I didn't think that one would fly for this panel, so I drafted a definition. Moral distance is the perceived distance between an observer and the person observed to assess whether the person observed is entitled to in-group status in moral calculus. Moral distance between an author and a work is a measurement of moral equivalence. As the moral distance between the author and the work goes to 0, the author and the work become morally indistinguishable. So that's my off-the-cuff formulation. I found a number of different kinds of uses of moral distance. It figures into discussions, for example, of genocide, which is under what circumstances do you think it's okay to kill somebody? And the greater the moral distance between you and somebody, the more likely you're going to think it's okay to kill them. So it's sort of an off-the-cuff usage for a different context. I think on the arts it's a little different than that, but at least I hope so.
Yeah. We're not talking about killing anybody, I don't think.
Yet.
Not yet.
We'll see how it goes.
Just as an entrance point, because I know this is going to come up, I wanted to raise the recent brouhaha.
No, you don't.
Yeah, I do, because it is going to come up. And I feel like it's something that should be addressed, but I don't want the whole panel to be, you know, consumed by this issue. I just wanted to kind of open the door.
You raised it, it's going to be consumed.
Well, And that's Elizabeth Moon, and her comments, not her comments per se, but just the reaction to those comments, her being disinvited as a guest of honor. I think that's an illustration of the question of moral distance and whether that was a decision that clearly, people have a right to say what they want, and then people have a right to respond however they want. But there was a element of coercion, in a way, that was going on here.
I would just like to say, I would like us to stay away, I would hope, because we could do 5 hours on whether a person should be invited or disinvited. I think we can enter the question of, can you read a particular individual's work knowing their opinions and disagreeing with them?
Yes.
But as to the issue of whether a person should or should not have been disinvited from a convention, I think we should get away. But can you continue to read a particular author knowing that his or her opinions violate your own personal standards?
Yeah,
that's a valid issue, but
here's my issue with what you just said, Paul. We're talking about the moral distance between an artist and his work. And nobody actually addressed Elizabeth Moon's work at all in any of the controversy that went on. And I like Scott, I would prefer to keep this focused on the distance between an artist and the moral distance between whether or not you approve of an artist and his individual beliefs and how you react or don't react to his work, which I think is what the focus of this was supposed to be.
Yeah. I've yet to hear anyone from either side address, knowing all of this, can you continue to read this particular individual's work with a clean slate and not having to cleanse your palate of that person's ideas? That, to me, is the issue that we're trying to...
So I want to plunge in firmly on one side so that everybody can disagree with me, and then we can really start the fun. Okay. I want to plunge in on the side that I think, yes, you can read somebody else's work, and should, if you wish to read that person's work at all, without necessarily considering their life. And I want to give just a couple examples here. Which goes from the ridiculous to the important. The ridiculous is that when I was a child, Elizabeth Taylor, the actress, was making Cleopatra. And while she was doing this, she was engaged in a lurid and public and attention-getting affair with Richard Burton. And they were both married to somebody else. I was a Catholic, and the Catholic League of Decency came out and said that nobody should ever see Elizabeth Taylor's movies, ever, any of them, because she was an immoral woman. Even at 11 years old, this struck me as a little bit ridiculous, because I could separate the Cleopatra who was up on the screen in what was unfortunately a disappointing movie from the actual person who was carrying on doing whatever it is that she was doing in Rome with somebody else's husband. And I think even then that they struck me as two different things, and they still do. A more serious example. When my son was in high school, one of the texts that he was assigned was excerpts from Mein Kampf. I think this is a good thing. I think that unless you read this sort of thing, you don't know what you're up against, you don't know what you're looking at. Nobody said, okay, well actually a couple parents did say, but you should not be reading this because it is bad and it is immoral and Hitler wrote it and it doesn't get much more immoral than that. But on the other hand, if you shut yourself off from knowing what the enemy, if you happen to perceive him as the enemy, and that's one we can probably all agree on, are saying, then you don't have those kinds of insights. And I think there is a distance between the artist and the art, not only for their sake, but for our own, on the basis of knowing what the wide range of possibilities are, so that when you shut yourself down from that, you are shutting yourself into a kind of willful ignorance that I don't see does anybody any good. Now, having put myself firmly on one end of the spectrum, maybe somebody else is at the other end.
Anybody else?
I'm not sure I'm on the other end of the spectrum, but this is a sort of different take on what the question is. I mean, one of the things I have an undergraduate math degree and kind of a weird head, so when I saw the word distance, and I started thinking about it, I started doing little diagrams on measuring distance.
I didn't bring my protractor, Kathy.
Yeah, I thought about drawing these up and handing them out to the panel, and I thought you'd think I was nuts, so I decided to skip that. But looking at, when I started sketching this, one of the things that was obvious to me that's not in the original formulation is the role of the observer. And, being the kid of a physicist, I was thinking of Devil Olbach to physics. But there is an observer who has a distance, and the further the moral distance from the author in the first place, the less distinguishable the author and the work are, for example. That little angle changes. It's sort of like, I started working with tags, optics and lenses and one thing or another. I have all these fine diagrams. But in any case, one of the things that came to mind when looking at this is that a lot has changed in the last 15 years. And 15 years ago, this would have been a question of canonicity, which is to say who survives and who doesn't. Does Ezra Pound get kicked out of the canon? Does Woody Allen as a director get kicked out of the canon because of the affair with with Mia Farrow's stepdaughter, and so on? In 2010, it's a question of whose writing and whose work we suppress, because of the reaction time is so much faster. And I mean suppression in the context of Joanna Russ's How to Suppress Women's Writing. She didn't write it. She shouldn't have written it. She wrote it, but look what she wrote. She only wrote one of them, etc. And that this is a very different dynamic, and the observer has a much larger role. There's not the long-term canonicity process that then says somebody's work is enduring and they're still in print 20 years later. It's a much, much faster thing. And that furthermore, it's not just the author over there and then an audience, but there's the interaction between authors then allows you measuring moral distances between different people. And so it's kind of a different problem than it would have been 15 years ago. I'm not sure if this is in opposition to what you said or if it's just a completely different take.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah. Maybe I should have done the diagrams.
I come at it a little bit differently. I think if you don't know anything about the writer, I'm talking just reading fiction, because that's what I'm focused on in this. And I come at a book, if there's not a detectable nastiness coming through, like, oh, this guy, he's obviously a pedophile, that's why he's writing this book. If I'm enjoying the book on its own terms, maybe I even start loving this writer, and later on I find out something unsavory about him. In my experience, it does kind of turn me off a little bit, but I've already accepted his art, the way he puts his words together, and the way he puts his stories together. Then I'm second guessing myself. Is there an undercurrent of some horrible thing in here that I'm missing? And by reading all those books, am I somehow absorbing this nasty flavor? I don't think so. I'm thinking of a guy, remember when was it, back in the 70s, Norman Mailer got this prisoner out of
Jack Abbott.
Jack Abbott, right. He wrote a book called In the Belly of the Beast, which was dynamite. And he knew his subject because he was in the belly of the beast. It was prison life and the rest of it.
I read that book.
I really liked it. But he got out, and there was some celebrity involved, and he wound up murdering somebody.
In a very short period.
Very short period. Well, he was a hothead for sure. So that book is still good. He knew his subject. I didn't go into it thinking, I'm not going to read a book by an immoral guy in prison for murder because he's a horrible person. I wanted to see what came out of his head. Because he had talent, he had facility with language, and he had a life experience that was so far away from my daily experience that I wanted to see that, and I did see it. But that's fiction. When you talk about Mein Kampf, that's more like a manifesto for,
Do we need to distinguish between fiction and nonfiction?
Oh yeah.
I think so.
Absolutely.
I think you do, just in this practical sense. There are all kinds of reasons why people should read Mein Kampf. Even if you detest the work and it's painful to read it, you should read it, because this is things you should know. Just like I urge people to go see Lenny Reichsteller's Triumph of the Will as a movie, just if you want to, it's part of your education. But you don't go see it because it's fiction, you want to be entertained. I do not listen much to Wagner's music. The reason is not because he was an anti-Semite, the reason is because I can't stand the music. It's long-winded. He somehow has this reputation of being a dramatist when everything that happens in his dramas because somebody has slipped a potion.